Okay, so you want to get a handle on how judges get picked in India, especially this whole collegium system thing, right? Well, you've come to the right place because in this deep dive, we're going to break it all down.
We are.
We've got articles, we got expert analyses, the whole shebang.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
So to kick things off,
Yeah.
let's just lay it out. Most people don't realize that the collegium system isn't actually in the Indian Constitution.
That's right.
It isn't.
Yeah, it's evolved over time, mainly from a bunch of Supreme Court decisions. They call them the judges' cases.
Okay.
And those cases kind of shaped how much power the judiciary versus the government has in these appointments.
So it's like the judges were making up the rules of the game as they went along.
In a way, yeah.
That sounds kind of ripe for controversy, wouldn't you say?
Well, I mean, the goal is to make sure the courts are truly independent.
Right.
Not swayed by politics. But that very idea, that setup, that's led to all these accusations that the Collegium is super secretive. Right. Or maybe even playing favorites.
Yeah, so that's the tension here. It's like, how do you make sure things are fair, but also, above board?
Absolutely.
So just to kind of back up a little bit and make sure we're all on the same page here. So technically, the president appoints Supreme Court judges, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then for high courts, it's the president, again, acting on advice from, folks like the Chief Justice of India.
That's right.
And others. But that's where this collegium thing comes in.
Yeah.
Adding that extra layer of like the judicial say-so.
Yeah. It's a whole other layer.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack these judges' cases then.
Okay.
Because they sound like they were pretty pivotal in kind of shifting this balance of power back and forth.
They really were. So the first judge's case in 1981, that kind of tilted things toward the government, gave them more say.
Okay.
But then came the second judge's case in 93, and that's when the Chief Justice of India,
The CJI.
yeah, the CJI, got a much bigger role. That's where this whole collegium idea was born.
Okay, so it's like a power shift towards the judges,
Yeah.
but not the full-blown system as we know it today.
Exactly. That was the final piece with the third judge's case in 98.
Oh, okay.
And this basically established the 5-judge collegium.
Okay.
So the CJI plus the 4 most senior Supreme Court judges.
Right.
And they made it so that even if 2 of those folks dissented, they could block a recommendation.
Oh, wow. So it's like a small group with a lot of power.
Yeah, a lot of influence.
Yeah. But hold on. Wasn't there this whole attempt to just like scrap the collegium completely?
Yeah, that was the National Judicial Appointments Commission, or NJJC.
Right.
They proposed that back in 2014.
Right.
And instead of just having judges, they wanted to include the law minister and like some eminent persons, like a real mix.
So a much broader kind of group.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty big change. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, I think the idea was to try to address those criticisms of the collegium,
Yeah.
about it being so closed off. But the Supreme Court actually struck down the NJJC in 2015.
They did.
Saying it violated, like the basic structure of the Constitution, and specifically that core idea of judicial independence.
Okay, so it's like judges need to be like totally free to judge without feeling like they owe the government anything, even in how they're chosen.
Right, exactly.
But that raises a question for me, though. If it's all about independence, like, why do we even need the government involved at all?
That's a great point.
Why not just, like, let the judges appoint whoever they deem fit?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it gets right to the heart of this whole debate. Some argue that, the current system where the government can, like, delay or stall these appointments, that actually undermines the whole point of independence.
Ah, so it's like this constant tug of war that never really ends.
Yeah, kind of.
So tell me, what are some of the strongest arguments, like, in favor of the collegium system? Why do its supporters think it actually works?
Well, besides the judicial independence thing we talked about, they often say it's about expertise in selecting judges.
Okay.
You want people on the bench who really, truly understand the law, who've been through it all, who've handled all these complicated cases.
Right.
One of the articles we read put it really well. It said, it's judges judging judges, not politicians.
Okay, so it's like you want professionals vetting their own, kind of like, if you had a panel of surgeons deciding who gets to operate with them.
Mm-hmm.
But wouldn't that create this system that's like really resistant to change.
Yeah.
You know, like too set in its ways.
That is a concern that, that comes up a lot. And even people who support the Collegium would agree with that.
Okay.
But they'd argue that judges are still in the best position to really assess what qualities and experience are needed on the courts.
Okay.
Like, think about the types of rulings they have to deal with these days. Cryptocurrency,
Yeah.
data privacy, electoral bonds. It's not stuff just anyone can grasp.
You're telling me it's a whole other world.
Right. It's a specialized skill set for sure.
Okay, but wouldn't that then create the risk of like ending up at the Supreme Court that's totally out of touch with what regular people are worried about?
That's another criticism that comes up. But supporters would say that the Collegium actually does the opposite, that it insulates the judiciary from populism.
Oh, okay.
Meaning judges aren't going to be swayed by public opinion or political pressure.
Okay, so give me an example of that. Like in the real world,
Sure.
how does that lead to decisions that might be unpopular but like necessary?
Think back to when the Supreme Court banned firecrackers in Delhi.
Yeah.
Remember that? To try to deal with air pollution. It wasn't exactly a move that made everyone happy,
Especially around Diwali.
Yeah, especially around Diwali.
Yeah.
But it was a decision based on what they saw as like the greater good, the bigger picture.
That's a great example. It really shows how the courts sometimes need to take a stand.
Yeah.
Even if it's not the popular thing to do.
Yeah.
So the argument is that without the Collegium, judges might be more hesitant to make those tough calls.
Exactly. They can focus on interpreting the law and the Constitution, not, what's trending on Twitter.
Yeah, right. That's a really compelling point. But even if the intentions are good, there's this whole question of like, how does this thing actually work in practice?
Yeah.
And one thing I'm curious about, there's this document called the Memorandum of Procedure,
Right.
or MOP, that's supposed to like guide this whole appointment process. So where does that fit in?
Think of the MOP as a kind of framework, a set of guidelines for both the government and the judiciary. It's supposed to bring some structure, some transparency to how things are done. There was actually, they tried to revise it back in 2015, but that revised version is still kind of in limbo.
So we got like a rule book that's not even finished yet?
Yeah.
No wonder there's so much confusion and debate.
Exactly.
I've also heard that even people who like the Collegium system, even they admit it's not perfect.
Right.
And that it needs to adapt. So what kind of changes are they pointing to?
Well, there's been this move toward interviewing candidates for high court positions, which they didn't do before.
Okay.
And some folks have tried to address that, whole nepotism thing, making sure it's not just a friends and family club.
So they're trying to like make it less of a black box.
Yeah, exactly. Open things up a bit.
Okay. So that brings us right back to like those big criticisms.
Right.
What are some of the key concerns that people have about the Collegium system, even if they agree with this whole idea of judicial independence, right?
Well, the biggest one is probably the lack of transparency.
Yeah.
There's often a lot of secrecy around how they make decisions, who even gets considered, why they're chosen, why they're rejected. It's very unclear.
Right, that lack of openness is definitely, you hear that a lot. And it's not just, coming from outsiders, right?
No.
Even some judges themselves have raised these concerns.
Yeah. Justice Kurian Joseph, he was on the Supreme Court.
Right.
And he even said publicly, the present Collegium system lacks transparency, accountability, and objectivity.
Wow. That's pretty significant coming from, someone who was part of that system.
Yeah. You can't just ignore that.
Right. You can't brush that aside.
Yeah.
But this lack of transparency also kind of feeds into another big criticism, doesn't it? This whole issue of nepotism.
Totally.
What some people call the uncle judge syndrome.
Yeah. Critics will point to these cases where judges seem to be appointing, their relatives or people with close ties to the current system.
Yeah.
And there's data to back this up. A 2015 report found that something like 50% of high court judges
Wow.
and a third of Supreme Court judges have family connections to high judicial positions.
Okay, so that's a pretty stark statistic.
Yeah.
It definitely like raises the question of whether it's really a level playing field for everyone.
Right.
But isn't this also connected to the larger issue of diversity on the courts?
Totally.
You know, the lack of representation from women, from marginalized communities, from different backgrounds, it's a pretty serious concern.
Yeah, it is.
And it goes beyond just being fair.
Yeah.
It affects, how much people trust the judiciary.
Absolutely.
Right? If the people on the bench don't actually reflect, the diversity of the country itself, it's hard for them to be seen as truly representing everyone's interests. But this isn't just about, perception either, right? There are real world consequences to these issues.
Oh, for sure.
Especially when you factor in those executive delays we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and that's where the rubber really meets the road. Because while the Collegium recommends judges, the government ultimately has to approve them.
Right.
And that's where things often get, stuck.
Right.
And it leads to, not enough judges.
Right.
A massive backlog of cases.
So it's not just like a theoretical problem. It's impacting people's, their access to justice every single day.
Exactly. To give you an idea, we're talking over 6 million cases pending at high courts all over India.
Oh, wow.
And something like 30% of judge positions are vacant.
Wow, that's staggering. And it's not just an abstract number either, right? These are real people, real lives that are being affected by these delays.
You're absolutely right. Think about someone who's been waiting years for their case to be heard. Their life is basically on hold because the system is so overloaded.
Right.
Or take the case of Justice Vidyut Ranjan Sarangi, who finally got appointed to a Chief Justice position, but he only had like 15 days left in his tenure because the government had delayed the approval for 6 months.
Oh, wow.
So, that's just one example.
Yeah, it really highlights like the human cost of all this inefficiency. And it's not just a moral issue either, right? There's an economic impact to all this, right?
Absolutely. When cases drag on for years, it affects everything. Businesses, investments, livelihoods. There was one study that estimated this whole judicial inefficiency thing is costing India something like 1.5% of its GDP every year.
Wow. So it's hitting the country's wallet too.
It is.
This is really really eye-opening stuff. Okay, so we've got this system, right? It's meant to safeguard this whole judicial independence thing, but it's clearly got some serious challenges. Concerns about how transparent things are, nepotism, diversity, and these executive delays that are just like clogging up the whole system. But like, what can be done about it? Are there any solutions, any real viable solutions to reform the Collegium system and address these really, really pressing issues?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And it's one that we're going to dig into in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so stay tuned because we'll be right back. So before we, well, not really a break since, this is a deep dive, but before we kept going, we were really getting into it with this whole Collegium system in India. It's supposed to protect the courts from outside influence, but it's getting hit with a lot of criticism too.
Yeah, definitely. And now we get to the interesting part, right? Like, what do we do about it? Can you actually reform this thing, or is it like fundamentally flawed?
That's what I want to know. It's easy to just, point fingers and complain, but coming up with solutions that actually work, that's the real challenge.
For sure.
But where do we even start?
Well, there are like a lot of really smart folks out there, legal experts, even some judges themselves who've been tossing around ideas. One of the most common ones is this thing called codifying the Collegium's procedures.
Codify. Okay, you're going to have to like break that down for me. Does that mean like literally just write it all down, make it like an official rule book?
Exactly. Right now, the way they do things, it's all based on like informal practices, precedents, stuff that isn't clearly spelled out anywhere.
Okay.
And that's part of why it seems so secretive,
Yeah, it's like trying to play a game where nobody actually knows what the rules are.
Exactly. So codification would mean like actually setting clear guidelines written down. How are judges selected? What are the timelines for making decisions? What are the eligibility criteria? All that stuff. It would bring a lot more structure, a lot more accountability to the whole process.
So it's like creating a Judicial Appointments 101 manual.
Yeah.
Making everything transparent and like consistent. Sounds good in theory, but wouldn't that be a huge undertaking?
Yeah.
It would be a big shift, yeah. And it would require both the judiciary and the government to be on board. But a lot of people think it's necessary, to actually get the public to trust the system again.
Right, because right now it feels like a lot is happening behind closed doors. But just like writing it all down, that wouldn't solve everything, would it?
No.
Especially when it comes to like making sure there's more diversity
Yeah.
and that people are actually following those guidelines.
That's true. That's why a lot of reformers are also pushing for way more transparency in like the actual decisions the Collegium makes.
Okay.
So think about it. What if they had to like publish detailed records of their discussions?
Yeah.
Including the reasons why they chose someone or why they rejected someone.
Whoa, so no more secret meetings where they make decisions and nobody knows why.
Right. It would make it a lot harder to, play favorites or give preferential treatment
Yeah.
because those decisions would be open for everyone to see. Of course, the judges would have to be willing to give up some of their privacy and control, which might be tough. Yeah, that's a big ask. But then again, like, if you're really committed to fairness and accountability, what do you have to hide, right?
That's the question.
Okay, so we've got codification, we've got transparency. What about the whole diversity issue on the bench? Are there any, like, concrete steps that could be taken to address that?
This is where it gets tricky. Some experts have suggested, like, setting actual diversity goals, maybe even quotas, for appointing judges from groups that are underrepresented.
So, like, actually saying, okay, we need at least this many women judges, this many judges from minority communities, that kind of thing.
Yep, that's the idea, to actually take steps to ensure that the judiciary reflects, the actual diversity of Indian society. It's definitely a controversial topic, and there are legal and political hurdles to think about, but it's a conversation that needs to happen.
For sure. And it's not just about, like, checking boxes.
Right.
It's about making sure everyone feels represented
Right.
and that the courts are hearing from a wider range of perspectives.
Yeah.
But, okay, let's be realistic here. Even if we did all of that, there's still that issue of, like, the government dragging their feet, right? The executive delays. How do you actually stop them from stalling the appointment process?
The million-dollar question, part 2.
Yeah.
One idea that's been floating around is to set like really strict timelines for the government to respond to the Collegium's recommendations and like make those timelines enforceable.
So it's like a deadline. They've got, like, X number of weeks to either approve or reject a candidate, or we just assume it's a yes.
Exactly. It would force them to like actually act quickly and prevent those super long delays that are leading to all those vacancies and that, crazy backlog of cases. But of course, getting the government to agree to that kind of system, that's a whole other battle.
Yeah, you'd need a lot of political will for that, and that's not always easy to come by. But I'm curious, besides these, like, structural changes, are there any other, like, more out-of-the-box ideas for reforming the Collegium?
There are a few that are gaining some traction. One is to like set up a dedicated secretariat for each high court and the Supreme Court.
A secretariat. Okay, what would that even do? I'm picturing, like, a room full of people just filing paperwork.
It's more than just paperwork, though. That's part of it. It's really about giving the Collegium administrative support,
Okay.
streamlining the whole appointment process, managing information, coordinating with the government, even doing background checks on potential candidates. It would take a lot off the judges' plates.
Okay, so it's like giving them their own staff so the judges can actually focus on, judging.
Exactly, make the whole thing more efficient. And another idea that's getting some attention is like using technology.
Technology. Okay, now I'm really interested. How would that work?
Well, think about all the data that's out there, right?
Yeah.
Judges' rulings, their backgrounds, their qualifications, caseloads, even public feedback. What if we could use AI, like artificial intelligence, to analyze all that and identify the best candidates?
Whoa, so it's like AI matchmaking, but for judges.
Kinda, yeah. Of course, you'd still need humans involved to like make the final decisions, but AI could help make the process way more data-driven, more objective, more transparent.
So it's using technology to, like, help humans do their jobs better, not replace them altogether.
Right, exactly.
But wouldn't people be worried about, like, bias creeping into those AI systems? I mean, they're only as good as the data they're trained on, right?
That's a valid concern, for sure. Any reform effort would have to address that and make sure those systems are, designed and implemented ethically.
Right. It's not like a magic solution. But it's pretty cool to think about how technology could potentially be used to, like, actually improve the system.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Codification, transparency, diversity goals, even AI-powered solutions.
A lot on the table.
But even with all these ideas, there's still the question of, like, actually putting them into practice. How do you get from brainstorming to, like, actually making changes happen.
Right, that's the real challenge, isn't it? It's not enough to just have good ideas. You need the people who actually have the power, the judges, the government, and ultimately the public, to be on board.
Right. It's going to take a lot of convincing, a lot of negotiating, maybe even some compromising. And even if you do manage to implement these reforms, there's always the chance they won't actually work the way you hoped.
That's true. And we haven't even talked about the potential pushback from within the judiciary itself. Some judges might not be too happy about giving up power or opening up the system to more scrutiny.
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room, isn't it? Change is hard, especially when it involves, traditions and power structures that have been around for a long time.
Absolutely. But the fact that we are having these conversations, that there's this growing awareness that things need to change, that's a good sign. And I bet our listeners are thinking the same thing. What does this mean for the future of the Collegium itself?
Right. Will it survive? Will it change? Will it be replaced with something completely different? Those are the questions we're tackling in the final part of our deep dive, so
Yeah.
don't go anywhere. Well, we're back. And that was quite the journey, wasn't it?
It was.
I mean, we really dug into India's Collegium system, that unique way they use their judges. We talked about like where it came from, what works, what doesn't,
Right.
and even like brainstorm some pretty radical reform ideas.
We did.
So now we got to ask, right, what does the future hold for this whole system?
Yeah, the big question, right.
Is it on the way out?
Right.
Or was it here to stay, maybe with some tweaks?
Right.
So I got to ask, you've got the expert view here. What are you seeing? Like, what are you keeping an eye on that might give us some clues?
Well, one thing that's really striking to me is like how much louder the calls for reform are getting. And from more and more different people. It's not just, legal scholars or activists anymore.
Right.
Even some judges are speaking out, publicly, expressing their concerns, suggesting changes.
So it's like the pressure's coming from both inside and outside.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that pressure from inside, that's only going to grow.
Right.
Especially as younger judges who might, care more about transparency and accountability as they move up the ranks.
Right. New generations often bring new ideas.
Yeah.
But let's not forget about the government in all of this.
Right.
I mean, they've been a big part of this whole appointment process, and any kind of reform is probably going to need their cooperation.
It will. And that's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
I mean, the political landscape in India it's pretty complex right now.
Right.
It's a very delicate balance between the judiciary and the executive branch.
Right. That tension is kind of built into the whole system, isn't it?
It is.
But how does that play into the future of the Collegium specifically?
Well, on the one hand, the government has been willing to, at least talk about reform.
Okay.
Remember that revised memorandum of procedure we mentioned? They were part of those discussions. So they're not totally shutting down the idea of change.
Okay, so they're at least open to it.
They're open to talking, but on the other hand, there are some signs that maybe they're looking for ways to assert more control over judicial appointments.
Okay.
Think about those delays in approving the Collegium's recommendations.
Right.
Some people see that as a tactic to try to pressure or influence the process.
So it's kind of like a mixed bag then.
It is.
Like they're talking about it, but they're also making moves that suggest they want to keep or maybe even increase their influence.
You got it. It's a really delicate balancing act, and how it all plays out, well, that's going to have a huge impact on whether the Collegium survives.
So it's like a lot is riding on this. What other pieces of the puzzle are you watching?
One word: perception.
Okay.
The legitimacy of any judicial system, it really comes down to whether the public trusts it.
Right.
And right now, there's a lot of, I think, unease, skepticism among people in India about how judges are chosen.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, all the things we've talked about, right? Lack of transparency, nepotism, delays.
It all adds up.
It really chips away at people's confidence.
It does. And if people start seeing the Collegium as opaque, unaccountable, out of touch, well, there's going to be even more pressure to change it.
Yeah.
Either reform it or replace it completely.
So public opinion, that could be the deciding factor. Like if people lose faith in the system, something's got to change.
I think so.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, in a democracy, the courts get their authority from the people. If that connection is broken, the whole system is in trouble.
This has been amazing. We've really gotten into the nitty-gritty of India's collegium system, its history, its flaws, and all the potential paths it could take.
It's been a great deep dive, for sure.
It has.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay, hit me.
Imagine you had the power to change one thing about the collegium system, just one fundamental reform. What would it be, and why?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It really
Why?
makes you think about what's most important in our justice system: fairness, transparency, representation, and how to make those things a reality.
Exactly. And as you're thinking about that, I encourage you to keep learning about this really vital part of India's democracy. The collegium, with all its, its quirks and its controversies, it plays a huge role in shaping the legal landscape.
It does. Well, thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive, and a huge thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We hope you've come away with a better understanding of India's collegium system and all the debates surrounding it. Keep those questions coming and stay curious.